It's now my pleasure to talk to you about our closing keynote speaker. She is a professor of the practice of electrical and computer engineering and computer science at Duke University. Prior to joining Duke, she was an associate professor with tenure at the University of Florida in the Department of Computer and Information Science and Engineering. She earned her Bachelor of Science and Master of Science in Electrical Engineering from the Florida Agriculture and Mechanical University, Florida State University College of Engineering, and an SM, which I learned last night is just a different way of writing Master of Science, and PhD from the MIT Media Lab. Her research focuses on the design, implementation, and evaluation of technologies, programs, and curricula to support diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM fields. Her approach is focused on three key strategies: designing, implementing, and evaluating technologies that enhance interpersonal skills that will facilitate collaboration in diverse settings, creating technologies and programs geared towards making computing and engineering accessible to diverse audiences, and mentoring, participating in outreach, and researching the experiences of marginalized groups in computing and engineering. Having garnered over $40 million in funding from public and private sources to support her research activities, our speaker's work has been featured in such venues as USA Today, Forbes, National Public Radio, and the Chicago Tribune. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Chandra Daly.
All right, good morning. Oh, thank you. Oh, that's great. I was like, everybody's gonna be asleep today. It's the last day. Everybody's been partying, but it's good. It's good. All right, so it's an honor and pleasure to be with you here today. When I was first thinking about what I was gonna say, I was gonna thank the person who mentioned my name in the room that I wasn't, that invited me here, but now I found it. It's one of my colleagues. So I really appreciate, Kristen, the invitation to be here. I'm also grateful to the committee for the invitation. So I was excited to see the two Barbaras who shared a bit of their own histories before me, because after many iterations of me trying to figure out what I was going to say today, I honed in on a bit of personal history as well. So I don't see my slides. There they are. And actually, my notes disappeared from here, Kyle, if you don't mind. I'll keep talking. So I am going to start by taking it way back. My daughter would say way back to the 80s. And give you a bit of my personal journey. So in this picture are 4 generations: my great-grandmother, my mother, my grandmother, and then me, the non-compliant, don't take my picture child. I'm going to start with my great-grandmother. She was born in 1909 in Belle Rose, Louisiana. Her name is Rosalie Parker, and she and her family were sharecroppers on land down there. And when the landowner decided that both the land and she belonged to her, that actually produced my grandmother, who was born in 1928. Years later, my grandmother met my grandfather, John Polite, and they were married, and they moved to New Orleans, Louisiana. If you're not familiar with the lower Ninth Ward, that's where they moved. When Hurricane Betsy in 1965 and Hurricane Katrina in 2005 hit, this is where the levees either broke or were broken, depending on who you ask. This is where my grandmother and grandfather were raising a family. And while they later split, they had 6 children together. This is 4 of the 6. I asked my mom for 6, but she said, we were trying to survive. We didn't have time for all those pictures. So this is this is what she gave me. She was the second oldest of the six. Her brother directly to the right of her, everybody used to think they were twins, but they were actually like a year and a half apart. She grew up wanting to be a nurse. That was her just dream to be. But my mother, who was a maid, and my grandmother, who was a maid, and my grandfather, who was a construction worker, didn't see nursing as a future for my mother at the time. And so they encouraged her to be either a teacher, which was accessible, or a secretary. And so my mom decided to be a secretary. And eventually, she became the first person in her family to go to college. And she actually got a degree in office administration from what was then LSUNO. She also was very active in the NAACP. Quick funny, I don't know if it's funny, she never told me about any of this stuff until I was in my 30s. So I found out later that she was this really feisty, like active, doing sit-ins, getting arrested kind of chick, but she didn't want me to know. I don't know if she thought I would like rebel or what, but yeah, my mother was in there, so proud of that. Yeah. And so she finished a degree, like I said, first in her family, and that was 1972. So forgive the scale of these timelines. I understand that these years do not evenly space apart, but I'm in a room full of computer scientists, so I was like, I gotta point out that I'm aware. But this is what I've laid out so far, starting in 1909 with my great-grandmother, 1928 with my grandmother, 1950 with my mother, and then 1972 when my mother graduated from LSUNO. And I'm setting this out because I want to talk about briefly not just about what was happening in my family, but what was happening in the world around them. All right, so again, as I mentioned, my grandmother was born in 1909, which was, 44 years after the abolishment of slavery from the 13th Amendment. When my grandmother, or I guess 8 years before my grandmother was born, that's when the 19th Amendment was passed, which was voting rights for women. 1941, during World War II, was the Tuskegee Airmen, which was the first black aviators. That's when they had their first cadets. And it was in spite of the belief that people believed that black people could not operate equipment that was as sophisticated as planes. My mother was born 9 years after that. Shortly after my mother was born, Brown versus Education, which established that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. She bought me this, I almost wore it today, she bought me this awesome t-shirt talking about Ruby Bridges. She actually went to school a few schools away, a few districts away from Ruby Bridges, and so she watched this and celebrated it and felt a part of that. So it was a big deal for her. And then in 1964 and 1965, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act passed, right? So really a lot of history happening, as my great-grandmother, my grandmother, and my mother were growing up. And I want to overlay this history also with Jim Crow era, right? This is basically laws that legalized segregation, right? As well as the civil rights movement, all right? And lastly, I want to add what I think is an important moment in the development of computing as well as computing culture and education, right? The space race, right? And so I'm showing this because some of the major developments of what computing is today and what our institutions are today were developed and happened when people who looked like me, people in my family, right, could not be in those spaces and places. Like, a lot of times we were just not part of those conversations. And that's not to say that we were absent. John Stanley was IBM's first black software engineer in 1946. And then Hidden Figures, yay, the movie, brought out, Katherine Johnson and others, other women who were an important part of NASA and planning the space flights. So there were some people that were involved, but largely, right, when you look at the timeline and you think about what's happening in history, we weren't present, right? All right, so got you to 1972 when my mom graduated college. I was actually born in 1979, just a few years later, in Nashville, Tennessee, all right? If you think the resemblance to my mom is there, yes, you were seeing it right. She used to travel a lot, and she used to travel to Atlanta, and I remember one time I went to Atlanta by myself, and a woman approached me. She was like, "Oh my God, are you Joan Bryant's daughter?" And I was like, "Well, yes." I was like, "Have we met?" She said, "Oh no, I've just seen your mom before, and that's you." Okay. So I was a kid that was always into something. So when my parents split, when I was at the age of 5, and my mom, according to her words, was not about to let my energy kill her, she put me into gymnastics, which I continued to do for another 9 years, was one of the most important parts of my growing up experiences. I did that through level 9. I thought I was going to be Betty Okino. That didn't happen, but that's okay. But the day I left gymnastics, I literally told my coach that I was leaving. I got in the car, and my mom said, "Okay, what are you doing next?" And I said, "Well, I haven't figured it out." She was like, "You understand the rules here. Like, you have to do something." And I was like, "Well, I have friends that do dance." She said, "Great." And she literally drove me to the dance studio. So I spent the next few years doing dance. I did some cheer. I did some dance team types of things. This is me and one of my really good friends in high school being silly. I tried modeling for a while, but it turns out like being into fashion is actually a good thing if you want to model, and I wasn't, so that didn't last very long. I also was very active in my church community. I had a real passion for working with kids, doing educational related activities. And no matter what, the thing that I really loved was creating. And that might mean me trying to find like a hammer and nails to build something, or drawing. I loved art, but I was always wanting to create, right? And even though we didn't necessarily have the tools or the resources or the access to help me bring these wild ideas into fruition, I definitely tried for better or for worse, and explosion, and we'll pass over the rest of that. Come on. So then it came time for me to go to college, and my mother did not give me an option. I will say when I was growing up, because she had a mother who always told her, you could be a secretary or you could be a teacher. She told me I could be whatever. She used to page me. I remember I would be upstairs in the house, and she would say, "Dr. Bryant, calling Dr. Bryant." And that was her way to softly, encourage me to do these things. She always focused on the fact that I needed to go to college to get a good job. That was kind of the focus then. And she always reminded me that she had taken equity out of our house to send me to our high school was Zone 4 was an F school. And so she sent me to a Catholic school. And she said, "I took equity out of our house to do this, so I've now spent all my money. It is your responsibility to find a way to go to this college that I'm demanding that you go to," right? And so I didn't have much guidance, but I decided that I wanted to be in the FBI. I did this crime scene in high school that was super cool in chemistry class, and I probably watched too much TV, but I thought that would be really cool. I happened to have a friend whose father was former CIA, and I asked him, I said, "Well, what do I major in?" He said, "Oh, you either do criminology or you do engineering, like that will help you to do that." I didn't know what either of those were, but this was not the age of Google. Let's be clear for the younger people in the audience. I did not have a computer. I did not have this kind of access. I did not have anybody in my family to tell me what it was. And so I just said, okay, cool, I'll pick one. So I think I lost my slides again. Oh, there we go, thank you. I eventually landed at Florida State University. Really complicated decision-making process. It was sunny and they gave me money. I was a National Achievement Scholar, which was really helpful. I also didn't want to go above the Mason-Dixon line. They were known for criminology, so my Florida people, insert your best Florida man joke. And the other piece of it that was actually quite important is that because I was dancing and I wasn't competing in gymnastics anymore, I wanted to be on the dance team. So this is me. We were the Golden Girls, which, okay, jokes. I've heard them all. And they were actually third in the nation when I went to Florida State, so that was pretty cool. And so, but at the end of the day, like, I didn't know what I was doing, right? I picked civil engineering because a friend of mine was going into civil engineering, and that was just like, okay, that sounds good. Luckily, the scholarship that I had for being a part of the National Achievement Scholarship Program required me to do interviews with people in my field, as well as do research and stuff like that. And so I remember very clearly, I went into a professor's office. He was in civil engineering. He's now the president of Virginia State, great guy. And I said, okay, well, I have this scholarship, and they require me to do these interviews, and I'm supposed to find out, like, what do you do, and like how I can do it, and all that stuff. And I was super excited. He said, awesome. He said, well, I'm a civil engineer, and that means I deal with big things that don't move. And I was like, oh, okay. That sounds interesting. Tell me more. And he told me more, and I listened. And like the irony of it is, he was actually an earthquake engineer, and so like they were moving, but. But he had sufficiently like turned me away from like civil engineering, so I was like, I really should figure out like what this engineering thing is, so that I don't have to deal with big things that don't move, but they do. And so this is me. I was not first gen. I mentioned my mother already, but I was definitely first in STEM, clearly, right? But even with my diverse experiences growing up, my access to the mentoring program through my scholarship program, and a fantastic group of fellow engineers through the National Society of Black Engineers, I was stepping into an institution where the people, the policies, and the practices were not prepared for me. And hopefully I've laid out enough that you know where I'm coming from, but I'm gonna say a little bit more. The institution was not designed for me when I had no programming or any kind of computing experience outside of keyboarding in high school, but I was expected to know certain things coming in. The institution was not prepared for me or designed for me when, as a dancer, right, doing dance team and all of these things, translated to the opinion that I couldn't be smart enough or fit in enough because of these things that I was choosing to do. To the point where it was late into grad school that I hid that I was ever a part of these kinds of activities because I was afraid of the perceptions that people would have of me and my intelligence. The institution was not designed for me. I came to understand this with the individualistic culture. I came from a family where everybody helps everybody. Everybody wants everybody to do good, and that was not the culture that I was stepping into. The institution was not prepared for me when I mentioned to a professor that I had a hobby, and he said, "What?" And I said, "Things I do outside of engineering." And he said, "Well, when I was a student, you only did engineering. And I feel like if I didn't have a life, you all can't be serious if you have a life." Real conversation. I realized that I was not in an institution that was designed for me when I found out the weed out and competitive culture, right, which is hand in hand with the individualistic culture, of course. I realized that this institution was not designed for me when there's a disconnect between my community life and what my major was. So I was working in a community, I was teaching kids networking and about computers, and just loved doing these things. I loved being engaged with my community and the people around me, but I couldn't bring that part of myself into the classroom, right? I was there to learn about transistors, I was there to learn about C, I was there to learn about a really narrow things. I realized that this institution was not designed for me when there were limited views, excuse me, on acceptable research. So I mentioned that I was first to STEM, getting this degree, and I remember I had a professor, I took 2 of her classes, and she pulled me aside one day and she said, "Shawnee, you've really done well in my classes. I think you should consider graduate school." I said, "That's great. I will consider graduate school as soon as you tell me what that is." Okay? I had no idea. She was smart though, because her response was, "Oh, if you go and get a PhD, that means nobody can tell you what to do." So she tricked me. But I went for it. So I entered the PhD program, again, not really knowing what that meant. As I began to try to find, I had a scholarship as well, but as I began to try to find research that I was excited about, I couldn't find it. And so I went to my dean and I said, "Hey, I would really love to do educational robotics. Like, this is awesome. Like, I can do the education stuff that I love, and I can also do the technology piece that I love." And he said, "Shawnee, we can't give you an engineering degree for doing education." And I said, No. Hear me out. I want to build things with my engineering skills, and it's just gonna be used in education. And he said, "No, you can't do that here." And so I started doing research. I looked at Carnegie Mellon, I looked at Vanderbilt, I looked at Stanford, I looked at MIT, I looked at all these places, and I was writing these papers, trying to convince him that I could actually do this and he could actually call it engineering, and I just got no. So I left, okay? And I went to MIT, and I was able to do these things that I was excited about. I was doing row ballet, which was combining one of my passions, which was dance, with building robotics. We actually wired up the stage. It was really cool, to sensors on the kids' bodies, and we were exploring, like, how do you think about movement? How do you think about dance? How do you think about coding, and how all these things come together? I was working on with the early Scratch team. This is 2003 at this point. My voice, I'm still bitter about this, my voice was in Scratch once upon a time, and they got rid of me in the second version. Right? I know. They should put it back. I was in Learn to Teach, Teach to Learn, which is a program that was connected with the Boston community. Mel King, who was a big activist in that community in Tent City, and we were working with kids in maker spaces, and they were coming up with computational solutions to things that they identified in their community. I was working on Change Lab, which was a similar project to Learn to Teach, Teach to Learn, excuse me, which had a network of people, adults and students, who were coming together to solve problems, as well as develop their own business ideas. I had a chance to work in Birmingham, Alabama on the failed, as we all know, OLPC project, but oh, what a learning experience that was. And I worked on Vinvi, which was a passion project of mine, drawing on the ideas of row ballet, but also using movement and a virtual environment to teach concepts in computer programming. So I was doing all of this work. It was so exciting. And even though, you know, I'm working with Seymour Papert, I'm working with David Cavallo, I'm working with Mitch Resnick, like all of my then heroes, right, who were showing me that there was a world where I could exist. And even though I had developed a lot of coping strategies, right, to deal with the culture that I was in, you know, even here, I figured out that the institution was not necessarily designed for me, okay? So top left, that's my first baby. That's Layla. That's clearly me pregnant. And then that's me with my second baby looking super happy. I was like, I can't use this picture, but I was like, whatever, it's reality. Looking really happy at a conference, all right? But I learned that the institution was not designed for me. I had really severe, complicated medical name, but it's for morning sickness, where if I did not eat every 2 hours, if I smelled something that was off, it was over for me. But I had to persist because there was nothing that I could do except just be pregnant and suffer. I learned that the institution was not designed for me when there was no maternity leave for graduate students. So I had my first child in 2006. In July of 2006, I took my qualifying exams in January of 2007. So my first 6 months of being a mother, which also for the moms in the room, she rejected a bottle, so she required me for the first 6 months every 2 hours, if not more. I was preparing for my qualifying exams during this time. I learned that the institution was not designed for me when we couldn't even really live on the stipend that I had. We were lucky enough to live in a dorm, which defrayed a lot of our housing cost. But there was analysis done at that time where they figured out that the only people who could really live off the stipend that they were giving us as graduate students was single people living on campus in a multi-room dorm room. Everybody else was underwater unless they had a financially stable partner who was not a student, key, right? And I learned that the institution was not designed for me because I couldn't get any childcare for Layla. I put her on the list, mini list. The first call that I got for an opening for Layla was when she was 2.5 years old. So the reason that I put the picture of my kid in the conference with me is because Layla went everywhere. And I see some faces in the room who have known her since she was little because of that, because she went to conferences and she went to talks and she went to class. She went everywhere because we did not have the support that we needed to get through. And I did eventually, after 2 pregnancies, having to get a second master's because when I left the PhD program, I opted out with a master's. I defended, and in 2010, I graduated. I walked in 2011. I eventually moved into a faculty position. I don't want to belabor the point of institutions that weren't designed for me, but you can, think about institutional policies that impact faculty. And while at the highlight reel level, right, these accomplishments might be something to applaud and to celebrate. They came at great personal cost, physically, emotionally, spiritually, mentally, right? So here we are now. It's 2022. And maybe you're thinking that these experiences that I'm sharing, since they're way back, right, aren't reflective of what's happening now. But there are amazing researchers, some of who are in this room, some of who I've put on the slide, that allow me to confidently say that the same systems that were not designed for me are perpetuating the same harm for Black women today. And this is not true only for Black women. Let me be very clear. I am telling my story as a Black woman who is light-skinned, who is able-bodied, who is heterosexual, and is from a lower middle-income class family. But this harm is true for a broad spectrum of identities who were either not part of the development of computing culture, computing pedagogies, computing policies, and other systems that are negatively impacting us, all of us. There we go. All right, so I was trying to describe what I do to my now almost 16-year-old child, and so she helped me with this picture. So we have all of these students, but as I pointed out, there's a very narrowly defined path to success. And at the end of the day, some students are successful because they fit a certain mold. Others make it through but it's not without harm or not surviving being their fullest selves. And then some we completely lose, right? And I know there's limitations to this imagery. You know, of course we hope that our students come out different in some way, but we'd like those ways to be positive. And so when we have only certain students that are able to make it through, we end up with a narrow range of perspectives at the table who are continuing to shape, the culture, who are continuing to shape the policies, who are continuing to shape the practices, but also influencing the direction of technologies that are produced. So I'm guessing for this group that I do not have to cover all of the negative things that have come out, right, around predictive policing, right, around biased algorithms, all of these things. We're pretty well immersed in this. And I'm guessing that I don't necessarily have to cover, you know, the statistics for women, which have remained pretty stagnant for a while now, or marginalized groups, which have done the same, right? I'm guessing I don't have to cover that. Excuse me. And I know a lot of us at this conference have dedicated time and energy to addressing the diversity in the field with a variety of approaches. Some of the things that we've done include early exposure, mentoring programs, affinity groups, special panels, workshops, action forums, X-only programs, and role models and campaigns. And let me be clear as I move forward. I am not saying that these things are not important, and I've been a part of them for many, many years, since my undergraduate years. What I hope to convey to you today is that I don't believe that they're sufficient if we're really going to push the needle on diversity, equity, inclusion in computing. Thank you. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how we can kind of marry these efforts and start thinking, in addition to student-focused focused opportunities, to also think about the people, the policies, and the practices that are shaping institutions so that we can push them forward. All right, so I mentioned some of the obstacles that I faced coming up and as a student, stepping into institutions that were not designed for me. And of course, I can't mention all of them at this point, but I just want to point out some more here. Lack of AP or computing course access, inaccessible materials, stereotypes by educators, by staff, by peers, campus policing, asked to shoulder all the DEI work, no culturally relevant curriculum, not connecting, requiring self-funded laptops, entrance exams, inequitable teaching assistant selection, and I would add training, and then lack of diversity amongst educators. Expectations that everyone learns at the same pace. I was really happy when one of my SIGCSE heroes, Dan Garcia, reached out to let me know his work that he's doing, A's for all, thinking about mastery learning, so I'm excited to see where that goes. Obstacles for faculty. So if you do make it past being a student, there's still these obstacles for faculty. Limited perspectives on what counts as research. H index measures. Micro and macroaggressions from colleagues and students. Assumptions on your qualifications, right? Being called Miss or Mr. Rather than professor, because that's the assumption. Having the stereotypes of being angry, being asked to shoulder, that's a consistent thing, right? All the DEI work, inequitable pay, and biased student evaluations. All of these are pretty well researched. And then these obstacles do not stop, right? If you go into industry, right? It's not simply within academic institutions, and the Kapor Center has done a great job of identifying a lot of these obstacles. Hiring from the same set of top-tier, quote-unquote, universities, bias in resume review and interview practices, pay inequality, being passed over for advancement, microaggressions, harassment again, little access to startup funds for founders. So these are all of the things that we might encounter, some of the things we might encounter when we're a part of a marginalized groups stepping into institutions that are not designed for us. So I wanted to spend the rest of our time quickly here to cover what we're doing in the Alliance for Identity Inclusive Computing Education that was recently funded by the National Science Foundation. So ACE is founded upon evidence that student-focused and often deficit-based strategies do not adequately address institutional cultures, policies, and practices that have marginalized people from non-dominant identities. Our vision is to increase the retention, entry, and course degree completion of high school and undergraduate students from groups that are historically underrepresented in computing through evidence-based identity-inclusive interventions. When I say historically underrepresented, I mean a broad spectrum of identities that have been marginalized in computing based on race and ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, age, ability, nationality, and other aspects of identity, as well as the intersections in between. ACE's collective impact approach to broadening participation convenes national leaders from K through 16 education to transform high school and post-secondary CS education using innovative strategies that target the people, the policies, and the practices that directly impact student entry, retention, and course degree completion. With this type of institutional transformation in mind, there we go. We've organized the Alliance into working groups. They're called constellations, and they might change over time, but this is where we started. Training, policy, curriculum and pedagogy, as well as research. And collectively, we will work to drive institutional change. I'm going to quickly point to some of the activities that we're currently planning, but I'd invite you to speak to people in our Alliance network to learn more about what they're doing. So for training, Valerie Barr from Mount Holyoke College is leading our training constellation. Some of the activities that we've proposed include the Cultural Competence in Computing Fellows Program, undergraduate TA training material, CSTA entry groups, as well as an Intro to Identity toolkit that will be a self-paced resource for K through 12 teachers. For curricula and pedagogy, college identity inclusive courses, as well as modules. There's a working group there. High school CS provider community summit, as well as a disciplinary commons group that's going to connect high school and college together. Degree retention and analysis, 3C assessment, the climate survey, and the K through 12 CS teacher survey when it comes to research. And then policy, thinking about recommendations, working with CSAB, as well as a teacher policy committee and advocacy toolkit. Undergirding all of this, we're working with UW Do-It Center to be cross-constellation to make sure that the things that we are doing are accessible. These are some of our partners. Again, a lot of you are in the room. So excited to have you on board. And I hope that others in the room will consider joining us. I started with 4 generations, and I'm going to end with 3. My parents, I mentioned earlier that they split, but after many years of being apart, they reunited and remarried each other. Yeah. And so now they actually live in my house, and we support each other as we live life. My kids, who are almost 13 and almost 16, if you've known them, I'll give you a second to process that. But other than a family who has decided to live life together, there's a lot of things that I see in this picture. I see my mom who has been ravaged by a disease that has left her disabled, and it makes me think of mask policies who are not thinking about the immunocompromised, excuse me. I see my dad who is many years sober after recovering from drug and alcohol addiction. And I think about policies that ignore mental health, right? I see my children who are in key moments of identity development. They're figuring out who they like, oh God, you know, who they love, and navigating these things. But I immediately think about the growing and violent policies that are coming up against trans children that are threatening the lives of so many. And when I look at myself, I see a girl who loved to build stuff. That's what I love to do. I love to create, and entered engineering and was enjoying creating, but became immersed in DEI because of the injustices that she was seeing, not because that's what she grew up wanting to do. And as a result, has been an outlier in her research community because this is not real engineering or real computing, right? All of these thoughts make it clear to me that in addition to the narrow paths to computing, there's a fundamental misunderstanding about our identities and also our humanity. And I think we have to all take responsibility for examining the gaps and the weaknesses in our own understanding of identity. This is a process of not only learning, but also unlearning. And we have to make room for people to make mistakes and recover from them. And I'm hoping that we can use the lessons learned to change our policies, to change our practices, to change ourselves, so that we're no longer negatively impacting people that are in our classrooms, that are in our departments, that are in our schools, that are in our institutions, and our world broadly. So if you don't know where to start, listen to Black women, listen to Indigenous women, listen to Latinx community, listen to Asian women, listen to queer researchers, listen to trans researchers, listen to disability researchers, listen to the people who have these lived experiences and are telling you it's not okay. All right? Listen, oh. We're telling you what's wrong, so hear us. And don't just stop at hearing us. Use your privilege, use your power, use your influence to make sure that the computing community of 2023, of 2027, of 2035, when my children and friends' children are entering your institutions, are not meeting with the same obstacles and harm and difficulties that we're meeting with today. Thank you. Do you have time for questions? Okay.
I'm just going to monitor Passable for you.
Absolutely.
Wasn't that amazing? We do have time for questions. I don't see any yet in the Passable chat, so I also can't.
I'm Maureen.
Yeah, go
Is the
ahead,
mic
Maureen.
on? Thank you. This was fabulous. It was more than what I hoped for. I'm a department chair. Do you want me to take this off? Can you hear me?
I'm a little hard of hearing in one of my ears,
Okay.
but I'm okay.
All right. I'm a department chair, and one of the things I've struggled with is pay inequity with faculty. And it occurred to me as my last year as department chair that the system is broken, but I don't know how to fix it. So the problem is someone comes in, the men ask for more money, they get it, and there's an imbalance. And I looked at the person I think will be incoming, and I said, quit telling the women they need to ask for more money and fix a system so that they're not always losing. But have you given any thought to what that might look like? Because I'm struggling with that currently. I know that's might be too hard, I don't know.
Yeah, it is a hard question. And I'm going to call out Carla Bradley, who is like one of the most amazing strategists I know and has been a dean and has, as I know, thought about these kinds of things. I will say, for our students that we have in a women's program that I work with at Duke, the Duke Technology Scholars Program, We make everything transparent. So there's a file that all of our members have access to, and they say what their salaries are, how they negotiated, what their benefits are, and they just make it all public in their community. And that enables a level of transparency that you might not get from the companies and the institution. And so it's not coming from, where you might want to, but until then, they've created a community quite brilliantly, I think, to address that.
So I still haven't seen any questions on Pathable, but it is filled with accolades. They're doing a standing ovation for you on Pathable, too. Someone at this mic?
Thank you so much for the talk and for sharing so much of yourself. One of the things I was thinking about was the professor who told you, what do you mean you have a life outside of engineering? And I see that for our students these days in that the students who don't have time for personal projects are less likely to get interviews or job offers because companies, even the companies that claim to be committed to diversity, assume that everyone should do this. But I know that my students who are working 20 or 30 hours a week can't. How do we help companies understand that they have to look beyond the students who somehow have the privilege to do all this extra work?
Yeah, that's a phenomenal question, and I think our responsibility is on the messaging and letting the companies know these things and passing that word. But I also think that we can find creative strategies to involve our students in this. So I do a lot of independent studies with students so that they have the opportunity to do a personal project that they can talk about when they graduate. I actually just met with one of my students who was talking about applying to graduate school, and she was so afraid about saying, hey, I don't have any research experience. And I said, Amy, that's what we did while you were here. She was like, oh. She was like, I never really thought about it like that, right? But that's what we had done, right? She got some research experience, right? And I pointed out, and actually closing that gap on what it means to do research, right, was important too for her. And so being really creative about our curriculum and the kind of flexibility that we allow our students so that it's a part of what they're doing rather than needing to last or happen outside of what they're already responsible for on top of things like working hours.
Okay, let's go to the center mic.
Shani, thank you so much for this talk. What an inspiring piece of work you're doing, and so inspiring to hear your story as well. I think about how much transparency. You can't fix what you're not measuring and then marking that. So I appreciate kind of industry trying to finally releasing their numbers of how bad diversity has been, and then be able to, if someone were kind of graduating and thinking that's an important thing for them, which I hope people would, then using those numbers to say, I'm going to go to the company that's really doing remarkable work in terms of making things accessible, making things there, and bringing the numbers up. So I'm wondering if that same level of transparency can work for undergrad spaces. My kids are about the same age as your kids, and as they're looking to what schools they go to, there's no way that I know of that any numbers of how safe it is to go to that school, how much is he and his cohort going to be supported in that they don't look like everybody else. So how do we get to, whose job would it be to kind of surface that? So rather than saying, well, here's the ranking of U.S. News and World Reports, which is great, that doesn't at all speak to what we care about and what a lot of students are going to be experiencing. So how do we surface who's doing a great job? Where are the exemplars? Is that something that you could possibly do or your group could do to say, look at these universities, they're winning awards for what they're doing to support students, and these are not, and so let's go to those schools and not to those schools. So how can we surface that, and whose job would it to do that? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. So that is, so I mentioned in our research policy, research constellation, that part of what we want to do is to think about like climate surveys and assessments, like how culturally competent are your faculty, right? What are students saying about where you are? And so I think that's an important space and something we're definitely thinking about with the Alliance. One other piece is we also are thinking about policy. And so I would love to see, you mentioned U.S. News World Report, U.S. News, Jesus, that one. You mentioned that. I would love to see them have a D&I measure, like as a part of how they're coming up with those rankings so that we can see, we can say something about it at the policy level. The other piece of it is, I think we have to be really careful and really strategic about how we collect these data and what we're saying, right? Immediately what comes to mind is like policing and how it's different in certain communities, right? And what that might mean for what people are saying about different institutions. And are we being crafty and careful about how we're collecting data and what we're saying about those data in order to report those kinds of things? So I would want us to be careful about that as well.
Let's go to this.
The far mic was up before I was.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
So you were talking about creating independent studies for students to give them that experience. And I'm thinking about my class this semester, which about 3 weeks, 4 weeks beforehand, doubled in size. I foresee that we're going to continue having increased enrollments, more students, and our time is going to become much more limited. How do you find that balance then with making sure individual tailored students are getting that experience, but also now you have 10 times as many students?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I can tell you what I do, and I'm guessing there's other people in the room that have some great strategies. When I do independent studies with students, I don't necessarily have one student working on, like everybody's not necessarily doing a bunch of different things. I have one project that students are working on different aspects of it so that it can compose its own independent study. And what that means, not independent study, own project composed of different independent studies. What that ends up meaning for me is that it's not like I'm having to coordinate lots of different things. I'm kind of coordinating one thing. We meet as a group, individually where necessary, and we're all working together on that project. What I've seen that do, especially with my minoritized students, is that they feel like they have community. A lot of times with independent studies, it kind of trails off because you're kind of by yourself. But having that kind of community where you're bringing people together seems like it works for a lot of times for my students. But also, a lot of times they're working on one of my research projects, so everybody wins.
Okay, we do have a question from one of our Pathable participants now. Shuchi Grover says, where would Dr. Daly like CS Ed research to go? What questions should we add to our research agenda today, in K-12 contexts especially?
So easy questions. So I will say, I won't specify what I think the research questions would be, but I would suggest that all of your questions are really taking this identity lens when you're asking them, right? So how are we thinking about identity in the context of what we're doing? I would also love to see more CS education, like PhD programs. Yeah.
Right here.
Wanted to follow up on the question about scale. I'm teaching intro-level classes with multiple hundred student enrollments, and we're doing a lot to try to reach out to students and whatnot. But I know from reading I've done, especially about students from low-income backgrounds, that they have cultural assumptions about the negative aspects of asking for help or admitting problems. So figuring out as a faculty member how to effectively communicate to students that we are aware of these issues, we want them to come get help with feeling like they belong and whatnot, is hard. I'm curious if you have any advice for those of us who are not from these communities in communicating to students and signaling to students that they should come talk to us, that we are aware and welcome. What's a good way to reach out to these students so that they let us help them in some sense?
So Anthony Jack has a really great book that I suggest I have a lot of books that I would suggest, but per your question, that I would suggest, excuse me, that speaks a lot about lower income students. Messaging, your syllabus is really important. I put a ridiculous amount in my syllabus as far as, some of the unwritten things that students might take for granted and might not know. I also stray away from calling things office hours. I also reach out in really targeted ways when students aren't showing up to ask questions about why. And I do a lot of modeling. What I found in my classroom, I teach intro to circuits to a lot of first-year students, and I make mistakes. And I frequently say, y'all, I messed up, or I don't know the answer to that, or let me find out. And I model, right, these habits and these ways of being, and I make them okay, normalize them, so to speak. So I think there's a lot of different ways that you can think about engaging students in different ways that might not engage you in the ways that you would like in order to be helpful. I also would caution to make assumptions about why students aren't engaging, right? Because the question from earlier about working, right, 30 hours a week, they just might not have time. And it might have anything to do with what you're doing or what you're saying or what you're modeling. And so coming to an understanding of who's in your classroom. I typically do a survey at the beginning of all my classes, asking students about, what they got going on, what might stand in the way, and how can I be helpful in those ways, just to make sure that I'm consistently connecting students with the right resources, because the right resource, the right resource is not always me.
Thank you. Back to Pathable. This may be a quick question, and it's already gotten some answers in Pathable, but Chris Gregg wants to know, is there a list of CS Ed PhD programs? I've had a number of students ask me about them. One of the responses pointed him towards Amy Coe's list of CS Ed faculty. Do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I think that's a great suggestion.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, and the next question from Pathable is, why did you decide to take a position as a professor of practice after being in a tenured faculty position?
Y'all trying to get me in trouble. So, two answers, two things about that. I had tenure at the University of Florida. About 6 months into my position, a dean at Duke I met, and she was like, I think you would be a great addition to Duke. And I said, that's cool, but I just got to UF. I'm good. I'm not going anywhere. We all know the end of the story, but let me tell it anyways. She said, oh, okay, that's cool. She said, but wait, didn't you mention that you had 2 kids? And I said, yeah, they're however old they were then. And she said, oh, well, Duke pays 75% tuition anywhere your kids want to go. I said, that was dirty. Yeah, so, yeah. So my move to Duke, in addition to the great opportunities that were there, were really about a choice for my kids, not a choice for my career almost at all. And so the way that professors of the practice work at Duke is you have a 5-year contract, and then you can be up for promotion or renewal. And I was like, okay, I only have to get them to like me twice more, and that will get my kids to college. Agreed.
Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for questions.
Awesome.
I know that there's several people who have been waiting. I assume that Dr. Daly will be around for a while, so catch her afterwards. Let us thank her once again.
Thank you.